Hi there, everybody. I hope you can hear me okay. Um, Again, my name is Marcelo Hernandez Castillo, and I am the Poet Laureate of Yuba and Sutter counties. I am just coming off the tail end of a 2-week residency in Ohio, where I teach at the Ashland University low-res MFA program. So yeah, I'm excited to join another month of programming here for Poetry Hour Notes from the Field as your poet laureate. And in the spirit of the last two times that we've talked, and because these sessions can be recorded, I am going to be pre-recording a conversation on the prose poem this time. And I guess these are all pedagogical platforms that I hope can build an archive that can be archived in a way that will lead us through in a thematic manner. If my son wakes up a little grumpy, he's asleep in the next room, and my dog is a little grumpy. So getting right into it, I'm going to be talking about the poem, and because this is, you have the ability to pause and you have the ability to write. I wanted to start off um, with a, and let me just share my screen if it will. Last time it didn't very well, but now let's see. I believe it is right now. I see. Okay. So here should be my screen. It's not a weird thing. So hopefully you can see it. Hopefully that's not the case. Let me actually try this again with a share screen with a window. That's not it either. Okay. Last one. Okay, I think it. This poem is called Hammer and Nail, and it is written by Naomi Shihab, who is the National Youth Poet Laureate, actually. She teaches in Texas, and this was written in 1994. She's one of my favorite poets. And this is a prose poem, which I'll talk about the intricacies. Hammer and Nail. Would you like to see where our little girl is buried? My friend asks as we walk between stucco shrines and wreaths of brilliant flowers. Even a plane's propeller is attached to a pilot's grave as if the whole thing might spin off into the wind. One man's relative built a castle over his remains, with turrets and towers to match the castle he built for his body and life. If you stand at a certain angle, you can see both castles at once. The bigger one he lived in off on the horizon. An archway says in Spanish, life is an illusion, death is the reality. Respect the dead whom you are visiting now. We hike down the hill toward the acres of, quote, free graves. Here people can claim any space they want, but also risk having someone buried on top of them. In Filipino cemetery, women walk slowly with buckets slung over their shoulders on poles. Black cows graze on the grass. The crossbar from the marker my friend's child's grave has come loose and lies off to one side. My friend kneels, pressing the simple blue crossbar back to the place. He's wishing The cross has delicate scalloped edges and words. Reminds me of the simplicity folded hands, though I know there were years of despair. My friend says, sometimes I am still very sad, but I no longer ask. This Castillo on the thoughts direction have alpine branches in the dirt. The needles droop, completely dry by now, but they must have looked lovely as miniature forests for the first piece. Okay. So the prompt that I wanted to start off with has to do with this poem, and because again you can pause and rewind, you can pause it and zoom in to find 5 words from this poem that stick out to you, that interest you, 5 words that for some reason or other is just in your gut instinct, they pique your interest. And so from those 5 words, I want you to write a poem and tell a story of what those 5 words are telling you. My 5 words that I choose will be very different than somebody else's. And even if we happen to choose one in a probably trillion chance that we all happen to choose the same 5 words, it is also much, much rarer that we'll come up with the same story behind them. Maybe these 5 words might have something to do with your personal life. And so you have led your own life in a way that is very different than mine, which is why, again, in the near minuscule impossible chance that we pick the same 5 words, it is even less of a chance that we will have the same outcome. And so let's, for example, my 5 words will be illusion, forest, despair, flowers, and shrine. And so just in there, I can already start thinking of a narrative that has those 5 words and how those 5 words play into my story. And again, this is, I say story by story, I mean narrative, and by narrative, I mean something that tells me either about you, something that is made up, or something in your personal life. So that's kind of the prompt that we can start off with. Write those 5 words on the top of your paper and then go in and try to link them together in one way or another. Okay, so that is a prose poem. And so what is a prose poem? A lot of people kind of, this might be the first time that you're coming to poetry. And so really all you might think about in terms of poems is the very classic lineated kind of poem. Sometimes they might rhyme. Most of the case with contemporary poems, they don't. And so the prose poem is an innovation that kind of combines, the vehicle of prose with the intricacies, the mechanics of poetry. So if you can kind of, as a car, the prose poem, the prose aspect of it is the form, is the body. It's the chest. It's the kind of car that it is. So it can be a Prius on the outside, but on the inside is the poetry, is the engine. So you can have a V8 souped up Prius on the inside, but that's what gets it going. That's what makes it rev. That's what charges it forward. So the container is just prose. It happens to be in prose, meaning it's not lineated, but the inner workings of it is the machine of it, the engine of it is poetry. And so I chose this poem in particular because is a very narrative piece. It is a very narrative poem. And so I guess there are two anthologies that that come to mind that I teach usually when I teach the prose poem. And again, this is a very short lecture. And last year I taught an entire semester of the prose poem. So it's really impossible to encapsulate everything that the prose poem comes with. But one of the things that we can all agree on is that there is an expansiveness to the prose poem that doesn't really happen in lineated poetry. And by lineated poetry, I mean any kind of poetry that is broken up into lines. It might seem haphazard sometimes that why did this poet break it here? Oh, because it's a poem. But that's really the only thing that we as poets have is the line break. And there's a lot to be said with the line break of the variation between lines of an enjambed line versus an end stop line. An enjambed line is that the syntax cuts across the line and reads right into the next line. An end stop line is that the syntax, the punctuation, the grammar ends at the end of the line where the line breaks. So, you know, this is where all the ideas of like repetition and pacing come in, because if you have lines that keep breaking the syntax, it moves faster. And we generally, you know, even tend to pause naturally at the end of a line break. Now, with the prose poem, we don't have that. You know, very literally, the prose poem is a poem without line breaks. But the prose poem resists generalizations. It's difficult to define it because there are so many avenues of thought behind this. The editors of this anthology, the prose poem from Baudelaire to Anne Carson, says that that the prose poem is the defining poetic invention of modernity. That the prose poem is more aligned to our lives of modernity, of the fragmented imagination, fragmented consciousness that came with the early 20th century, and that it is the prose poem that most closely aligns with the kinds of lives that we're living. And so this kind of really also matches with our modern age of the internet, of tweets and Facebook and Instagram, in which our lives are in these sound bites. We can't have the whole story, but we have these little sound bites. And that's kind of what something that the prose poem does. One claim is that our expectation is just visually. Our expectation when we see a passage of prose is that it will explain, not sing. When we see a passage of poetry, even before we come to it and understand it as a poem, that we already have an expectation of it in one way or another. And so, you know, it's a disarming kind of factor when we come across it as prose and then we understand it to be a poem, that it's going to sing and not necessarily explain. So the prose poem has the potential for poetry to be injected into prose. And I think I'll also just mention this because it's a very famous phrase. Samuel Taylor Coleridge posited that prose is words in their best order. So simply that. Poetry is the best words in the best order. And so prose poetry kind of has a difficult, it has a difficult kind of position there. And so in thinking about this poem, Hammer and Nail by Naomi Shihab Nye, we do have the elements of voice, of dialogue, and description, in which we hear, and you'll see I highlighted it here, people can claim any space they want without paying, but also risk having someone buried on top of them. In the fields beyond the cemetery, women walk slowly with buckets slung over their shoulders on poles. And so this isn't to say that lineated poetry is imagistic, which one of the very definitions of lineated poetry is that it distills the images that we have into a solidified, almost like a sacredness about it. But the prose poem approaches these images within the context of this situation of the cemetery in this case. There are a few others that I would like to show, and one of them is this really strange poem, also from this anthology that I teach from. And if I can just find it real quick, because it always slips away from me. Give me 1 second. You can fast forward. My files are always a mess. You can fast forward as I stall for time, because always this happens. Okay. I didn't find it, but it's okay because it's Tender Buttons by Gertrude Stein. And this is one of those weird poems that I always have. And Gertrude Stein was writing in the early part of the 20th century. She was mostly an art critic. She was living in Paris at the turn of the century, and she made this salon with and first person to champion art. So she was friends with Picasso, with Braque, with who else was in her inner circle? All these very more experimental artists that were really rupturing the way that we thought about art. And so she did with poetry what Picasso did with visual art, and kind of fragmented it into his cubism and saw this object from all angles at the exact same time. And so that's kind of what she did with poetry in her poems. I could stream this, I could share my screen, but it's not really going to help any better. I'm still trying to understand these poems myself. And these are prose poems. So, and actually let me share window, Chrome tab, Tender Buttons. Okay, cool. So this is Tender Buttons. These are all different prose poems. Coffee, nothing elegant, and so on and so forth. But the one that I kind of always come back to is a carafe. Carafe? I think it's a carafe. That is a blind glass. A kind in glass and a cousin. A spectacle and nothing strange. A single hurt color and an arrangement in a system pointing. All this and not ordinary, not unordered and not resembling. The difference is spreading. Okay, so if you didn't understand that, you're not alone. I also don't understand it, which is why the prose poem, with its beginnings, I think you could call its beginnings in Baudelaire, with these poems about Paris that he had. They were very cosmopolitan, even up to the present day. Claudia Rankine's book Citizen is a book of prose poems that, you know, garnered huge praise. I have it here somewhere. But the prose poem is a place to experiment, where language can just be itself without necessarily needing to be anything else. And in these poems, like Tender Buttons by Gertrude Stein, we have a moment that kind of exists outside of time, outside of place, outside of context. And this is a very, again, theoretical way of thinking about language, about thinking about poetry, about thinking about prose. But the prose poem is kind of where we can merge a language that is lyrical into the body of more analytical prose, I would say. So I would encourage you to check it out, to try out a short prose piece that focuses on one object in your house. And so try to make this object come alive. Perhaps it's a fork and you imagine it as a chicken's foot, which is a poem by Charles Simic, where he imagines this fork that he's using, this utensil, as a chicken's foot because it looks like a chicken's foot. He does it in this prose poem manner. The thing of it is, though, is that the prose poem is where you can really experiment with something strange, make something as strange and as surreal as possible. Surrealism and the prose poem have a lot of intersections. So take a look. And again, I wish I could spend an entire semester. In fact, I did spend an entire semester teaching at St. Mary's College simply on the prose poem. So I think that's all I will conclude with. Take a look at Gertrude Stein, take a look at Naomi Shihab Nye, and Carson. And Carson is a great person to go to if you're interested more in the prose poem. And of course, take a look at YubaSutterArts&Culture's programming. Next week, I will be doing a live event at the Sutter Theater called Atrium Vibe, where I'll be talking about process, chit-chatting here and there. So I welcome you to check that out and take a look at all the other programming going on by YubaSutterArts&Culture. Yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day, rest of your week, and I will see